HAZMAT and CBR. So HAZMAT stands for hazardous materials, otherwise known as dangerous goods. Now these are sort of toxic and poisonous agents that are used in the civilian and industrial setting, and you're likely to see them in industrial estates and in workplace injuries. So each one, because you can see down at the bottom here, there's all sorts of different sorts of dangerous goods. But for all of them, you will remove the person from the source, decontaminate them, and treat them symptomatically. Now, you're not expected to be an expert on every type of hazardous material or dangerous goods. Since these are almost exclusively involved at workplaces that have dangerous goods are required to have procedures and policies in place to manage exposures. So very often, all you'll be doing is assisting the workplace health and safety officer or the first aider on scene to follow their expected protocols. And they will have some sort of procedures in place which you can also follow for that material. But here's where it potentially gets very interesting, is in CBR. And the CBR stands for chemical, biological, and radiological. And these are the kind of things that you may see in terrorist events. So for chemical agents, there are 5 types. There's nerve gas, which we've all heard of. This is sarin gas, VX gas, and that causes organophosphate poisoning symptoms. So a parasympathetic overstimulation that dumbbells mnemonic patients, basically kills them by essentially drowning you in the fluids of your own lungs. There's blister agents or vesicants, which is mustard gas. Don't see too much of that these days. That was one of the popular gases in World War I. That causes chemical burns to the skin, but particularly to the eyes and the airway, and that's what's going to potentially kill people, is the airway involvement. You have choking agents, which we've seen overseas in Syria, which cause direct airway damage and people just choke to death and die of hypoxia. You've got cyanide poisoning, so blood poisoning, which interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen within the cell to make ATP. And then because your entire body has to switch over to anaerobic metabolism, you die of basically an energy deficiency, and which manifests as multi-organ failure. And then this is one that you may actually see, particularly if you work in bigger cities, is just tear gas, capsicum spray, riot control agents or things that the police might use, which aren't lethal, but they cause severe irritation of the eyes and mucous membranes, and they just require water or, like Johnson's No More Tears, to help clear those membranes, clear those eyes. Management of chemical agents will be managed by the fire department of whatever state you work at. Here in Queensland, QFES has special training and special decontamination units for use in these events, and we'll go over that in this lecture as well. So the management for chemical agents for you as a paramedic, when the patient's been decontaminated and they've got to you, is going to be airway control. So if they can have a rapid sequence intubation and RSI, that's ideal. And you may have to give them nebulized bronchodilators like salbutamol as well, to help relieve some of that muscarinic overstimulation. Like ipratropium is going to, basically the inhaled version of atropine is going to help dry up their lungs a little bit too. If they've had a big exposure, you can give atropine, so CCPs carry atropine, and the antidote for cyanide poisoning is hydroxycobalamin. The other agents don't have specific antidotes, it's just symptomatic management. So biological, there's 3 types again. So viruses, influenza, smallpox, Ebola, these sorts of things that could potentially be weaponized. You'll see patients after they have become ill and presented several days later. You're unlikely to go to them at the point of exposure. You can have bacterial agents. So if anyone remembers, about 15 years ago now, someone was mailing anthrax to the US Postal Service, and there were several exposures. There were about half a dozen deaths from that. Anthrax particular is usually fatal if it's in powder form and it's breathed. It just causes an extremely difficult to treat lobar pneumonia, which is usually lethal. And then you have toxins like botulism and ricin, usually not fatal if they're treated, and fairly difficult to disperse as well. They're not likely agents for bioterrorism. So if you do go to someone at the time that they've been exposed to these agents, you run through a normal decontamination procedure. But if you're going to someone who has symptoms, days after the exposure, decontamination is obviously not going to be useful at that point. You need to protect yourself at that point. So it's going to be PPE, so mask, gloves, and make sure you put a mask on the patient too, particularly if they're coughing. And then you have radiological exposures. So these can be accidental or intentional. So accidental exposures can happen because radioactive isotopes are used in a lot of medical devices and also in laboratories. So a couple of years ago in Mexico, there was a bunch of radiation poisoning and deaths from people who had been scavenging in a junkyard and had come across a medical device, I don't know exactly what it was, that had active radioactive isotopes in it, hadn't been disposed of properly. And because they were pretty and glowing, people were smearing it on themselves, and then it ended up causing a lot of death. So that's an accidental radiological exposure. And then obviously terrorism too. So we often think with radiation of nuclear bombs, but unlikely the terrorists would be able to get their hands on a nuclear bomb or have the know-how to use it. What you may see is a dirty bomb though, which is radioactive material packed around a conventional explosive like this. So while that won't kill anyone acutely, or apart from if they're standing right next to it when the conventional bomb goes off, it will disperse radioactive material over a wide area and contaminate entire city blocks. So you may see that sort of thing in your lifetime. Now the management for radiation is decontamination as per normal, managed by the fire department. The radiation isn't contagious. If someone's radioactive, they can't actually make you sick too. The decontamination is to remove any irradiated material, like if there was a dirty bomb, or if there had been some sort of exposure from a medical device or something. The decontamination will just be to remove the radioactive material currently on them. And then there's really not a lot for paramedics to do for radiation exposure. Acute radiation poisoning affects cell division, so we're not going to see that in the first hour or two. These people will become very sick and potentially die over days and weeks as their cells, the DNA becomes damaged every time the cell divides. So I've talked a lot about decontamination. This is how it actually works. So different fire departments and different services will have their own protocols, but they're all broadly based around this same idea. First, the patient needs to be wet down with their clothes on. The reason for that is that it makes any powders or dusts or whether that's chemical, biological, radiological, makes it stick to the clothing instead of dispersing it. So after they've been wet down, you remove the wet clothing, then you wash them, including their hair, with soap and warm water, which is considered very effective to decontaminate. Wash that soap and warm water off, and then cover them in a set of clean clothes or a blanket. Now what they can do for major events is set up these conveyor belts, and you can see that in this picture here, where patients will come in on a board, and there's teams of people who are in appropriate HAZMAT gear, ready to do a full decontamination, and the patient just comes out the other end of the conveyor belt into a waiting ambulance ready to be treated by the paramedics. At that point, they're not at risk anymore, they are decontaminated, and you just wear normal PPE. You don't need to wear like a full HAZMAT suit or anything. Obviously the exception there is biological contamination. If someone's symptomatic and they've had an Ebola exposure or smallpox exposure or something potentially, you want to be very careful with your PPE, both on yourself and on the patient. So PPE just means mask and gloves. Unless you're going to work in a specialised unit, which do exist in the different ambulance services, you're never going to be using HAZMAT, like the full gas mask, radiation suit type gear. The patients, as I said, by the time they come out from the scene, from the decontamination with the firefighters, they'll be essentially able to be treated as per normal.